The Cold War is often remembered as a managed standoff, a contest of ideologies kept in check by diplomacy and deterrence. That version is incomplete. What occurred between 1947 and 1991 was not simply a rivalry between two superpowers, but a sustained rehearsal for total annihilation, conducted in silence, maintained through secrecy, and punctuated by incidents that were never meant to be disclosed. The absence of a Third World War was not the result of strategic brilliance or moral restraint. It was the outcome of repeated accidents that failed to cascade, of miscommunications that were clarified seconds before becoming irreversible, and of individuals who disobeyed orders at moments when obedience would have triggered mechanisms designed to operate without further human input. These were not victories of diplomacy. They were statistical anomalies. This is an examination of 25 incidents during the Cold War that were suppressed, misreported or classified for decades because their disclosure would have destabilized the illusion that the conflict was under control. They were not under control. They were simply not yet fatal. In October 1962, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was operating beneath the surface of the Atlantic during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The vessel had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. The crew did not know whether war had already begun. American destroyers above were deploying practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface, a procedure the Soviets had not been informed of. Inside the submarine, temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were rising. The captain and the political officer both believed they were under attack. They decided to prepare a nuclear torpedo for launch. Soviet protocol required the agreement of 3 officers to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. 2 had already consented. The 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued that without confirmation from Moscow, the launch could not proceed. His refusal was not based on pacifism or moral clarity. It was procedural. The torpedo was not fired. The submarine surfaced, and within days, the crisis de-escalated. Archipov's decision remained classified by Soviet authorities for decades. The event was not publicly acknowledged until after the Cold War ended. There was no recognition, no commendation. The incident was filed and forgotten because its implications were unmanageable. A single individual, operating under extreme stress and without reliable information, had been the final barrier between a localized confrontation and a nuclear exchange. On the morning of November 9, 1979, computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command detected an incoming large-scale Soviet missile strike. The data indicated that over 2,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched toward the United States. Duty officers initiated emergency protocols. Strategic Air Command raised its alert status. Bomber crews were instructed to prepare for takeoff. The President's Airborne Command Center was readied for launch. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was awakened by a phone call informing him that the United States was under attack. He was told he would have 3 minutes to contact President Carter and recommend a retaliatory strike. Before making that call, Brzezinski received a second update. The number of incoming missiles had been revised upward. The scenario now indicated a full counterforce strike targeting American nuclear assets. He prepared to wake the president. Then a third call arrived. The warning had been triggered by a training tape that had been inadvertently inserted into the live system. There was no attack. The alert was cancelled. The incident was classified. It was not disclosed to Congress or the public. The explanation offered internally was that a technician had made a procedural error. What was not emphasized was that the system had no automatic safeguard to distinguish between a simulation and an actual event once the data had entered the operational network. The proximity to irreversible action was a function of timing, not judgment. In September 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite detected the launch of 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The system was newly operational and considered highly reliable. The data was processed and transmitted to the command center where Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty. Petrov's role was to assess the alert and, if validated, forward the information up the chain of command, which would initiate a retaliatory strike within minutes. The system's algorithms indicated a high probability that the launch was real. Protocol required him to report it immediately. Petrov concluded that the detection was a false alarm. His reasoning was not based on technical analysis. He judged that if the United States were initiating a first strike, it would not begin with only 5 missiles. It would be a massive, coordinated attack. He reported the alert as a system malfunction. He was correct. The satellites had misidentified sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile exhaust. The system had functioned as designed. The error was not in the software, but in the assumptions that governed its interpretation of ambiguous data. Petrov was not publicly honored. He was reassigned. The Soviet military conducted an internal review and concluded that the incident reflected poorly on the readiness of its detection systems. The details were kept restricted for years. Petrov's decision was not strategic. It was intuitive, personal, and contrary to his training. That it was correct does not mean it was reliable. During the early 1960s, the United States military deployed nuclear warheads to locations around the world as part of its deterrence strategy. One such deployment involved the placement of tactical nuclear weapons in Okinawa, Japan. The presence of these weapons was never officially disclosed to the Japanese government, despite agreements that prohibited the introduction of nuclear arms onto Japanese territory. The warheads were stored in concealed facilities and were under the control of American personnel who operated under standing orders that allowed for their use under certain battlefield conditions without requiring direct presidential authorization. In at least one documented incident, a near accident involving a storage facility led to the exposure of fissile material and the contamination of surrounding areas. The incident was contained, the personnel involved were relocated, and the contamination was classified as a maintenance issue. Japanese officials were not informed. The weapons remained in place for years. When their presence was later confirmed through declassified documents, the response from both governments was to characterize the deployment as a temporary and conditional measure that had been superseded by evolving policy. The weapons had been active and operational throughout the period in question. In January 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs experienced mechanical failure and broke apart over North Carolina. Both bombs were released during the breakup. One bomb deployed its parachute and landed relatively intact in a field. The other plummeted into swampy ground and embedded itself deep in the mud. Recovery teams were dispatched. The intact bomb was retrieved. Examination revealed that 5 of the 6 safety mechanisms designed to prevent accidental detonation had failed during the fall. Only a single low-voltage switch had remained in the safe position. Had that switch failed, the bomb would have detonated with a yield of approximately 4 megatons, more than 250 times the force of the weapon used at Hiroshima. The second bomb was never fully recovered. Portions of it, including components containing radioactive material, remain buried beneath a North Carolina field. The military purchased an easement over the land and prohibited any excavation. The incident was reported as a crash with no significant risk to the public. The proximity to detonation was classified and not disclosed for decades. When the details were eventually released, the official position was that the safety systems had performed adequately because the weapon did not detonate. The fact that only 1 of 6 barriers had remained functional was characterized as within acceptable tolerances. In 1968, a Soviet submarine designated K-129 sank in the Pacific Ocean under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. The vessel was carrying nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. The Soviet Navy conducted an extensive search but was unable to locate the wreck. The United States Navy, using advanced sonar and surveillance systems, identified the location of the submarine on the ocean floor, approximately 3 miles beneath the surface. The CIA initiated a covert operation to recover the submarine. A specialized ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, was constructed under the cover of a deep-sea mining operation. In 1974, the ship attempted to raise the wreck. The operation partially succeeded. A section of the submarine was recovered, including the remains of Soviet sailors, some of whom were given a formal burial at sea, which was filmed and later delivered to the Soviet Union. The recovery also retrieved codebooks, missile components, and nuclear warheads. The full extent of what was obtained was never disclosed. The Soviet government was aware that the United States had located and accessed the wreck, but chose not to formally protest, likely because any public acknowledgement would have required explaining the circumstances of the submarine's loss. The operation remained classified for years. When portions of the story were leaked to the press, both governments issued statements that minimized the strategic significance of the recovery. The nuclear warheads retrieved from the site were analyzed and provided insight into Soviet missile design, which influenced subsequent American weapons development. The incident was not an accident. It was an operation conducted in secret, involving the manipulation of a disaster for intelligence purposes, carried out with the understanding that disclosure would have diplomatic and strategic consequences. Neither side was willing to manage openly. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted numerous atmospheric nuclear tests in the Pacific and at the Nevada test site. Servicemen were positioned at close range to observe the effects of the blasts, often without adequate protective measures or informed consent. These personnel were subjected to intense radiation exposure. They were told the exercises were safe. Many were instructed to advance toward ground zero shortly after detonation to simulate battlefield conditions. Medical monitoring was inconsistent. Records were incomplete or deliberately obscured. Years later, veterans from these units began to experience cancers and other radiation-related illnesses at statistically abnormal rates. When they sought compensation or disclosure of exposure data, the military's initial response was to deny that hazardous conditions had existed. Documents that might have clarified exposure levels were classified or reported as lost. It was not until decades after the tests that partial acknowledgement occurred, and even then, compensation programs were limited and difficult to access. The justification provided by defense officials was that the tests were necessary to understand the effects of nuclear weapons on personnel and equipment, and that participants had been volunteers. In many cases, participation had not been voluntary, and the risks had not been disclosed. The use of servicemen as subjects in radiological research was a calculated decision, supported by legal frameworks that exempted military operations from civilian oversight. The long-term consequences were documented internally, but not communicated to those affected. In March 1980, a technician at the Titan II missile complex in Damascus, Arkansas, was performing routine maintenance when a socket wrench slipped from his hand and fell approximately 80 feet down the silo. The tool struck the side of the missile and punctured the fuel tank, releasing highly toxic and flammable propellant vapor. The crew evacuated the silo. Air Force specialists were dispatched to assess the situation. The missile was armed with a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead. As pressure built inside the silo from the vaporizing fuel, the risk of an explosion increased. 8 hours after the initial puncture, the missile exploded. The blast threw the warhead out of the silo. It landed several hundred feet away, intact but separated from the missile. One technician was killed by debris. Several others were injured. The warhead did not detonate. It was recovered, inspected, and returned to service. The official report classified the incident as an accident caused by human error. What was not emphasized in public statements was the lack of fail-safe mechanisms to prevent a fuel leak from escalating into a catastrophic explosion, or the fact that the warhead had been physically thrown from its housing by the force of the blast and could have been damaged in ways that might not have been immediately detectable. The missile complex was decommissioned shortly afterward, but dozens of similar silos remained operational for years with only minor modifications to maintenance protocols. In 1957, a fire broke out at the Windscale nuclear reactor facility in the United Kingdom. The reactor was used to produce plutonium for Britain's nuclear weapons program. The fire burned for 3 days and released a substantial quantity of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Surrounding areas were contaminated. Milk from local farms was found to contain unsafe levels of iodine-131 and was disposed of. The British government downplayed the severity of the incident and imposed restrictions on the release of information. Public statements characterized the fire as a minor operational issue that had been contained. In reality, the fire had nearly resulted in a core meltdown, and the radioactive plume had spread across parts of Europe. The full scale of the contamination and the potential health effects were not disclosed for decades. Studies conducted years later estimated that the fire may have caused hundreds of cancer cases. The incident was not widely reported internationally, in part because the British government was concerned about the impact on its nuclear weapons program and its relationship with the United States. The reactor was eventually closed, but information about the accident remained restricted under national security provisions. During the Berlin crisis of 1961, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated to the point where military forces on both sides were placed on high alert. At the checkpoint Charlie border crossing, American and Soviet tanks faced each other at a distance of less than 100 yards. Both sides were loaded with live ammunition. Orders had been issued that allowed local commanders to engage if fired upon. For 16 hours, the tanks remained in position. Neither side withdrew. The standoff was eventually resolved through back-channel communications between Washington and Moscow, but during the confrontation, there was no direct communication between the forces at the checkpoint. Each side interpreted the other's movements as potential preludes to attack. The situation was defused not by negotiation at the scene, but by decisions made remotely, without the knowledge of the soldiers involved. The incident was reported in the press as a tense but controlled demonstration of resolve. What was not reported was how close the situation came to escalation based on misinterpreted signals and the absence of real-time communication protocols between ground commanders. Procedures for de-escalation in such scenarios were developed only after this confrontation, and even then, they relied on the assumption that communication channels would remain open and that orders from higher command would arrive in time. In the early 1970s, the United States maintained a network of remote radar installations in Greenland as part of its early warning system. One such facility, known as Camp Century, was constructed beneath the ice sheet. The base was powered by a portable nuclear reactor and served as both a radar site and a research station. What was not publicly disclosed was that the facility also served as a testing ground for a plan known as Project Iceworm, which involved the deployment of intermediate-range ballistic missiles under the ice, where they would be mobile and difficult to detect. The project was eventually abandoned due to the instability of the ice and the logistical challenges of maintaining concealed launch sites in such an environment. When the base was decommissioned, the reactor was removed, but infrastructure, waste, and residual contamination were left in place, encased in ice. The expectation was that the material would remain frozen indefinitely. Recent studies have indicated that climate change is causing the ice sheet to melt at a faster rate than anticipated, raising the possibility that buried waste could eventually be released into the environment. The original agreements with Denmark, which governs Greenland, did not include disclosure of the weapons-related aspects of the project. The Danish government was informed only years later, after declassification of documents revealed the true scope of the installation. The materials remain beneath the ice. On November 24, 1961, a Strategic Air Command B-52 bomber carrying 2 hydrogen bombs crashed near Yuba City, California. The aircraft was on a routine training mission when it experienced mechanical failure and broke apart in mid-air. Both bombs were released during the breakup. Neither detonated. One bomb's parachute deployed, and it landed in a field. The other bomb struck the ground at high speed and was destroyed on impact, scattering radioactive debris across the crash site. Recovery teams secured the area and removed the contaminated material, but traces of plutonium remained in the soil. The Air Force conducted a cleanup operation and declared the site safe. Monitoring continued for several years, and while radiation levels were reported as low, some contamination persisted. The incident received limited press coverage and was characterized as a crash with no significant danger. The fact that the bombs had been armed and that some of their safety systems had failed during the fall was not disclosed at the time. The official narrative emphasized the effectiveness of the recovery operation rather than the circumstances that had brought two thermonuclear weapons within safety margins of detonation over American soil. In 1976, a Soviet pilot defected by flying a MiG-25 fighter jet from the Soviet Union to Japan. The aircraft was one of the most advanced interceptors in the Soviet arsenal, and its design and capabilities were among the most closely guarded secrets of the Soviet military. Japanese and American officials took custody of the aircraft and subjected it to detailed examination. The analysis revealed that while the MiG-25 was capable of extreme speed and altitude, its construction was less sophisticated than Western intelligence had estimated. It was built primarily of steel rather than advanced alloys, and its avionics were based on vacuum tube technology, which was considered obsolete by Western standards. The findings led to a reassessment of the perceived capabilities of Soviet air power. However, the defection also revealed the extent to which Western intelligence agencies had overestimated certain aspects of Soviet technology, which had influenced defense spending and strategic planning for years. The pilot was granted asylum in the United States. The aircraft was returned to the Soviet Union in pieces after the examination was complete. The incident was used by both sides for propaganda purposes, but the technical intelligence derived from the defection remained classified for years and informed the development of American aircraft and countermeasures. In 1987, a computer error at the NORAD command center triggered an alert indicating that Soviet submarines had launched ballistic missiles toward the United States. The alert was based on sensor data that appeared consistent with a launch sequence. Duty officers initiated verification procedures, but the data continued to show an ongoing attack. Communication protocols were activated and bomber crews were placed on alert. The error was identified within minutes when cross-referencing with other sensor networks produced no corroborating evidence. The alert was cancelled before any irreversible actions were taken. The cause was later determined to be a software fault that had misinterpreted routine submarine activity as a launch. The incident was not disclosed to the public at the time. It was reviewed internally, and modifications were made to the software to reduce the likelihood of similar errors. What remained unaddressed was the broader issue of reliance on automated systems that could generate alerts based on incomplete or ambiguous data, and the compressed timeframes within which decisions had to be made once such alerts were issued. The assumption that verification would always occur in time was itself a form of risk that was accepted rather than eliminated. Between 1951 and 1953, during the Korean War, there were multiple proposals within the U.S. military to use tactical nuclear weapons against Chinese and North Korean forces. General Douglas MacArthur advocated for the deployment of nuclear bombs along the Chinese border to create a radiological barrier that would prevent reinforcements from entering Korea. The proposal was seriously considered by military planners and was discussed at the highest levels of government. President Truman ultimately rejected the plan, in part due to concerns about Soviet retaliation and the risk of escalating the conflict into a broader war. MacArthur's continued advocacy for expanding the war, including the potential use of nuclear weapons, contributed to his removal from command. The existence of these plans was classified for years. When details were eventually disclosed, they revealed how close the United States had come to using nuclear weapons in a regional conflict, and how seriously such options were evaluated as tactical solutions. The decision not to use them was based on strategic calculations rather than moral prohibitions, and the framework for their potential use remained part of military doctrine throughout the Cold War. In August 1957, a fire broke out in a storage facility at the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado, where plutonium components for nuclear weapons were manufactured. The fire burned through filters designed to contain radioactive particles, releasing plutonium into the atmosphere. Monitoring equipment detected contamination in surrounding areas, including residential neighborhoods. The Atomic Energy Commission conducted a cleanup operation and issued statements minimizing the risk to public health. Residents were not informed of the full extent of the contamination, and long-term health monitoring was not implemented. Studies conducted decades later found elevated levels of plutonium in soil samples taken from areas downwind of the plant, and suggested a correlation between exposure and increased cancer rates in nearby populations. The plant continued to operate for years after the fire, and additional incidents of contamination occurred. It was not until the late 1980s that operations were suspended following an FBI raid related to environmental violations. The site was eventually designated for cleanup as part of a Superfund program, but disputes over the adequacy of the remediation efforts have continued. The initial fire and its consequences were treated as an operational issue rather than a public health crisis, and information was controlled to avoid undermining confidence in the nuclear weapons program. On October 27, 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane strayed into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula due to a navigation error. Soviet air defenses detected the incursion and scrambled fighter jets armed with air-to-air missiles, some of which were nuclear-tipped. The U-2 pilot realized the error and turned back toward Alaska. American F-102 interceptors were launched from Alaska to escort the U-2 back to friendly airspace. The F-102s were also armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles. Soviet fighters pursued the U-2 but did not engage before it left Soviet airspace. The incident occurred at a time when both sides were on heightened alert, and any exchange of fire could have been interpreted as the beginning of a broader attack. The incident was not disclosed to the public at the time, and even within government, the full details were restricted. President Kennedy was reportedly informed of the navigation error and expressed concern about the potential for such mistakes during a period of extreme tension. The episode underscored the risk that accidental incursions and technical failures posed during a crisis, particularly when response protocols allowed for rapid escalation without time for clarification or verification. In 1959, the United States Army began deploying Honest John rockets capable of carrying nuclear warheads to bases in West Germany. These weapons were intended for use in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The deployment was part of NATO's strategy of flexible response, which relied on the threat of tactical nuclear strikes to offset the Soviet Union's conventional force advantage. The warheads were stored separately from the delivery systems and were under the control of American personnel, but the missiles themselves were operated by units that included soldiers from NATO member countries. The authorization process for the use of these weapons was not clearly defined, and in some cases, local commanders had significant discretion in how and when they might be employed in a battlefield scenario. Exercises conducted during this period revealed confusion and inconsistencies in the chain of command and in the communication procedures that would govern the release of nuclear weapons during combat. These issues were documented in classified after-action reports, but were not resolved comprehensively. The weapons remained deployed throughout the Cold War, and the ambiguities in their command and control structure persisted as an accepted element of NATO's deterrent posture. In November 1965, a widespread power failure knocked out electricity across large portions of the northeastern United States and parts of Canada. The blackout affected millions of people and lasted for several hours. During the blackout, several military installations, including air defense sites and communication centers, lost primary power. Backup generators activated, but there was a brief period during which some early warning systems were offline or operating at reduced capacity. The blackout occurred at a time when Cold War tensions remained high, and there was initial concern within the military that the power loss could have been the result of sabotage or a coordinated attack. Standing orders required immediate investigation of any event that could impair defense readiness. Communication between command centers was disrupted, and for a short time, the status of certain radar sites and missile warning systems could not be confirmed. The blackout was eventually traced to a faulty relay at a power station in Ontario. No attack had occurred, and defensive systems were restored without incident. The episode was not treated as a security breach, and there was no public indication that military readiness had been compromised. Internal reviews, however, noted that the loss of civilian infrastructure had created vulnerabilities in defense networks that were dependent on commercial power grids, and that the potential for cascading failures during a crisis had not been adequately planned for. In 1969, the United States and the Soviet Union were both operating submarines equipped with ballistic missiles that patrolled the world's oceans as part of their strategic deterrent forces. These submarines were designed to remain undetected and to serve as a second strike capability in the event of a nuclear attack. On at least one occasion, a Soviet submarine and an American submarine came into close proximity while submerged, each unaware of the other's presence until their sonar systems detected the contact. Both vessels took evasive action, and the encounter ended without incident, but the proximity and the potential for collision raised concerns within both navies about the risks of operating nuclear-armed submarines in the same regions without coordination. A collision could have resulted in the loss of a submarine and its nuclear warheads, or could have been misinterpreted as a deliberate attack. There were no formal protocols for avoiding such encounters, and the operational zones of the two fleets overlapped significantly. The incident was classified, and even within the military, knowledge of it was restricted to senior commanders and intelligence officials. Procedures for avoiding collisions were eventually developed, but they relied on each side maintaining awareness of the other's patrol patterns, which was inherently imperfect, given the need for secrecy. In June 1980, a faulty computer chip at the NORAD command center caused a false alert indicating that a large-scale Soviet nuclear attack was underway. The alert was generated by the same systems that had been involved in previous false alarms, but in this instance the error was caused by a hardware failure rather than a software issue or a training tape. The chip had degraded over time and was producing random data that the system interpreted as valid sensor input. Duty officers initiated verification procedures, and within minutes the error was identified. The alert was cancelled, and no retaliatory actions were taken. The faulty chip was replaced, and additional diagnostics were implemented to detect similar hardware failures. The incident was classified and not disclosed publicly. It was the third major false alarm within a year, and internal reviews began to question the reliability of the early warning infrastructure. The recommendation was to increase redundancy and improve verification protocols. But the fundamental reliance on automated systems that operated under extreme time pressure remained unchanged. The expectation was that human operators would continue to serve as a check on machine errors, but the margin for human judgment was measured in minutes, and the volume and complexity of data being processed made it difficult to distinguish between actual attacks and system malfunctions with certainty. In 1953, the Soviet Union conducted a test of its first thermonuclear device. The test, known as Joe-4, demonstrated that the Soviets had successfully developed a weapon with significantly greater yield than the atomic bombs used in World War II. The test was conducted at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The explosion produced a yield of approximately 400 kilotons, far exceeding initial Western estimates of Soviet capabilities. The test site and the surrounding region were heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. Local populations were not evacuated, and many residents were exposed to hazardous levels of radiation. The Soviet government did not disclose the health effects or the extent of contamination. Medical personnel who treated affected individuals were instructed not to discuss the cases, and records were classified. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that documentation began to emerge, revealing the scale of the exposure and the long-term health consequences for those who lived near the test site. Thousands of people developed radiation-related illnesses, and elevated cancer rates persisted for generations. The decision to conduct the test without adequate safety measures or public disclosure was consistent with the broader pattern of prioritizing weapons development over civilian welfare, a pattern that was replicated in testing programs conducted by other nuclear powers, including the United States. In March 1984, during NATO military exercises in Europe, Soviet leadership became concerned that the exercises were being used as cover for a surprise attack. The exercises, codenamed Able Archer, simulated the NATO response to a Soviet invasion, including the use of nuclear weapons. Soviet intelligence had been monitoring the exercises closely and interpreted certain elements of the scenario as inconsistent with a training event. Among the concerns were changes in communication protocols, the movement of high-ranking officials, and the simulated authorization of nuclear release procedures that appeared more realistic than in previous exercises. The Soviet military raised its alert status, and some nuclear forces were placed on heightened readiness. The concern within the Soviet command was that NATO might be using the exercise to mask actual preparations for a first strike. The tension persisted for several days until the exercise concluded and normal operations resumed. Western intelligence agencies were unaware at the time of how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise and how close the situation had come to triggering a Soviet preemptive response. The incident was not widely understood until years later, when former Soviet officials disclosed how the exercise had been perceived. The episode revealed a dangerous gap in understanding between the two sides, where routine military activities could be misinterpreted as preparations for war, and where the other side's level of alarm was not visible or anticipated. In 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union conducted joint operations in space as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project. The mission was presented as a symbol of détente and cooperation. American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts docked their spacecraft in orbit, conducted joint experiments, and appeared together in televised broadcasts. The mission was a success from a diplomatic and public relations standpoint. What was not disclosed was that both space programs were simultaneously engaged in military projects that included the development of anti-satellite weapons, reconnaissance satellites, and other systems designed to function in the event of a conflict. The overlap between civilian space exploration and military space operations was significant, and personnel from both programs often worked on classified projects that were not acknowledged publicly. The cooperation in space was real, but it coexisted with ongoing competition and the development of capabilities intended to target the other side's space assets. The narrative of cooperation was accurate but incomplete, and the broader strategic context in which both programs operated remained classified. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained extensive networks of spies, informants, and covert operatives. These networks occasionally intersected in ways that led to confrontations, arrests, and in some cases, deaths. One such incident occurred in 1985, when Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer, began providing classified information to the Soviet Union. Ames's betrayal led to the exposure and execution of numerous American intelligence assets operating within the Soviet Union. The loss of these operatives was catastrophic for U.S. intelligence efforts and represented one of the most significant breaches in the history of American counterintelligence. The investigation into the source of the leaks took years, and during that time, additional operatives were compromised. Ames was eventually identified, arrested, and convicted of espionage. The details of his activities and the extent of the damage were not fully disclosed to the public, and much of the information remains classified. The case underscored the vulnerability of intelligence operations to infiltration and the difficulty of detecting betrayal within secure institutions. It also highlighted the human cost of espionage, as individuals who had risked their lives to provide information were identified and killed as a direct result of Ames's actions. In the final years of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union entered a period of political and economic instability, there were concerns within Western governments about the security of Soviet nuclear weapons. The fear was that the collapse of central authority could lead to the loss of control over nuclear arsenals, potentially allowing weapons or fissile material to fall into the hands of unauthorized actors. The United States initiated programs to assist the Soviet Union and later Russia in securing and dismantling nuclear weapons. These programs involved direct cooperation between American and Soviet scientists and military personnel, and included financial assistance for the construction of secure storage facilities and the decommissioning of warheads. The programs were conducted quietly and were not widely publicized, in part because both sides were sensitive to the perception that the Soviet nuclear arsenal was vulnerable. The cooperation was effective in reducing the immediate risks, but concerns about the security of nuclear materials persisted, particularly in the newly independent states that emerged from the Soviet Union, some of which inherited portions of the Soviet nuclear infrastructure without the resources or expertise to manage it securely. The issue of nuclear security in the former Soviet Union remains a point of concern decades after the end of the Cold War. The Cold War concluded not with a resolution of the underlying systems that had sustained it, but with the exhaustion of one participant. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Its nuclear arsenal remained intact. Command and control structures were transferred to successor states. Early warning systems continued to operate. Submarines remained on patrol. Missiles stayed in their silos. The infrastructure built to manage the possibility of total war was not dismantled. It was repurposed, updated, and in many cases, expanded. The incidents that nearly triggered catastrophe during the Cold War were not anomalies. They were features of a system designed to function at the edge of human reaction time, relying on procedures that assumed clarity in situations defined by ambiguity. The Cold War ended, but the mechanisms it produced did not.